I never planned on staying in Coorg for more than 4 days. It was one of those trips that happens when you've been staring at spreadsheets for 6 months straight and your body just starts refusing to cooperate. My manager had actually suggested I take leave. That's how bad it had gotten. I work in logistics coordination for a mid-sized export firm based out of Pune, and the last quarter had been brutal in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived through it. Deadlines stacking on top of deadlines, calls at odd hours, weekends that blurred into weekdays until the whole calendar felt like one long gray corridor. A colleague mentioned Coorg almost offhandedly during a lunch break. She'd gone there with her family 2 years earlier and said it was the kind of place where you could genuinely hear yourself think. That description stuck with me more than I expected. I booked a stay about 2 weeks later without telling anyone. Not my family, not my friends. I just needed to disappear for a while. The property I found was listed on one of those homestay platforms. It wasn't a resort. It wasn't a boutique hotel. It was an older house that had been converted into a guest house by the family that owned the surrounding coffee estate. The listing said the main family lived in a separate building further up the hill, and that guests had the lower house entirely to themselves. That was the part that appealed to me most. No staff hovering around, no other tourists asking where you were from and what you did for work. Just the house, the estate, and the sound of rain on coffee plants. I drove up from Mysore. The roads got narrower the further I went. By the time I turned onto the final stretch leading to the property, I was driving between rows of coffee plants that rose on both sides of the car. The GPS had stopped being useful about 15 minutes earlier, but the handwritten directions the owner had sent me over WhatsApp were surprisingly accurate. The house came into view just as it started drizzling. It was an old colonial-style structure. Cream walls, dark wooden window frames, a long covered veranda running across the front. There were potted plants everywhere, on the steps, along the railing, hanging from the beams above. Most of them were orchids, dozens of them. Different sizes, different colors. The owner had mentioned this in the listing, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. It looked like the kind of house that had been carefully tended for a very long time. The caretaker was a quiet older man named Raju. He showed me around without much conversation. The house had 3 rooms, but only one was made up for guests. The other 2 were kept locked. He showed me where the kitchen supplies were, explained that the geyser took about 10 minutes to heat up, pointed out the torch hanging near the back door in case the power went out, and told me that the estate got foggy after 9 at night. He said it almost like a warning. Then he left. I spent the first evening sitting on the veranda with a cup of tea, watching the fog do exactly what he described. It rolled in from the lower part of the estate slowly, covering the coffee plants until they disappeared entirely. The lights from the main house up the hill became soft, blurred shapes. Everything else became gray and quiet. I went to bed early that first night and slept better than I had in months. The second day was perfect. I walked through part of the estate in the morning, had a simple breakfast, read for several hours, and did nothing in particular for the rest of the afternoon. That might sound boring, but after the previous 6 months, it felt almost medicinal. By evening, I had genuinely stopped thinking about work for the first time in weeks. It was on the second night that something changed. I had been asleep for a few hours when I woke up suddenly. Not gradually, the way you usually transition out of sleep. I was just awake, fully, the way you get when something has interrupted you. The room was dark. The fog had thickened enough outside that almost no light came through the windows. I lay there for a moment, trying to understand what had woken me. Then I heard it. Someone was walking on the veranda. The veranda ran directly outside my room. The wooden floorboards were old, and they creaked with any weight placed on them. I had noticed this myself that evening when I'd been sitting out there. These were slow, deliberate steps. Not the sound of an animal. Not the sound of the wind moving something. These were footsteps. They moved from one end of the veranda toward my window. And then they stopped. I stayed completely still. My first thought was that the caretaker had come for some reason. But it was past midnight, and there had been no knock on the door, no voice. Why would anyone be standing outside my window at this hour without announcing themselves? The footsteps didn't resume. I waited. Nothing. After a few minutes, I got up and went to the window. The fog was dense enough that I could barely see 2 feet beyond the glass. I pressed my face close to it and looked along the length of the veranda. I couldn't see anyone. The chairs I'd been sitting in earlier were empty. The hanging orchids swayed very slightly in the damp air. I told myself it had been an animal. A dog, perhaps, or something moving across the roof. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to Raju when he came to check if I needed anything. I framed it lightly. I said I thought I'd heard something on the veranda during the night and asked if there were dogs on the property. He nodded slowly and said there were 2 dogs, but they were kept near the main house at night and didn't come down to the lower building. He didn't offer anything else. He just picked up the empty tea tray and left. I spent most of the 3rd day outside and tried not to think about it, but there was something that kept nagging at me. The orchids on the veranda. When I'd arrived, there had been a particular cluster of them hanging near the far left corner. I remembered them clearly because a few of the flowers were an unusual deep purple. That morning, those pots had been moved. They were now arranged near the right side of the veranda, directly beside my window. I hadn't moved them. I asked Raju in the evening whether he had rearranged anything on the veranda. He looked at me for a moment without expression and said no. I described which pots I meant specifically. He said he hadn't touched them. That was the 3rd evening. I almost left that night. I actually sat on the bed with my bag half packed for about 20 minutes. Then I told myself I was being irrational. Pots don't move on their own. Either Raju had moved them and didn't want to admit it for some reason, or I had simply misremembered where they were when I arrived. People misremember things. I had been tired when I got there. I put my clothes back in the bag and decided to stay. I wish I had trusted my instinct. That night, I made sure to lock the veranda side door before going to sleep. There was a sliding bolt on it, and I pushed it all the way across. I also propped a chair under the handle of the main entrance door. These were probably useless precautions, but they made me feel better. I fell asleep around 11. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke up again. This time it wasn't footsteps that woke me. The smell woke me. There was a strong floral smell in the room. Not unpleasant exactly, but overwhelming. The kind of concentration that becomes uncomfortable rather than nice. It took me a moment to place it, and then I realized what it reminded me of. The orchids. The smell was similar to certain orchid varieties, sweet and slightly medicinal. But I was inside a closed room. The windows were shut. The door was bolted. I turned on the torch on my phone and swept it around the room. There was a small orchid pot sitting on the writing desk near the far wall. I had not put it there. I know with complete certainty that I had not put it there because I had never touched any of the orchid pots at any point during my stay. I had admired them from a distance. I had never picked one up. I stared at it for a long time. The pot was one of the purple ones, the ones that had been moved to the area beside my window. I picked up my phone, unlocked the door, and walked out of the house at 2:30 in the morning with my bag. I walked up the hill through the fog toward the lights of the main house. I knocked on the door and waited. The owner's wife opened it after a few minutes, looking understandably confused and alarmed. I told her I needed to check out. She asked if something was wrong. I told her about the orchid in the room. Her expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read. It wasn't quite surprise. It was something more like recognition. She said something to her husband, who had appeared behind her, in Kodava, which I don't understand. He replied briefly. She turned back to me and said that the lower house was old, and that sometimes strange things happen there. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, as if she were explaining that the plumbing occasionally made noise. She refunded me the remaining nights without any discussion. I drove back toward Mysore in the dark with the fog lights on and the windows up. I told myself the whole way back that there had to be an explanation, that Raju had been playing some kind of strange prank, that I had accidentally moved the pot in my sleep, that the smell had come through a gap somewhere. I'm still telling myself that. But when I got home and went through my photos from the first evening on the veranda, I found one I'd taken casually while sipping tea. In the background, clearly visible, were the purple orchid pots, hanging on the left side. All of them accounted for. All of them. I travel a lot for work, not glamorous travel. The kind where you're catching the 6 a.m. train with a laptop bag and a disposable coffee cup, and you've already answered 4 emails before the platform announcer finishes saying the train number. I cover a territory that includes several smaller cities, and I usually prefer trains over flights for anything under 5 hours. Trains let me work. You can open your laptop on a train without someone's elbow in your face, and you can think without the pressure of a seatbelt sign. I had just finished 2 days of back-to-back client meetings in a city I'll call simply a Tier 2 city in the central part of the country. The meetings had gone on longer than expected, and by the time I reached the railway station, it was close to 11 at night. My train was at 11:45. The station wasn't large, but it was busy enough at that hour. Several long-distance trains passed through during the night, and so the waiting areas had a reasonable number of people. I found my platform, confirmed the train number on the board, and sat down on a bench near the middle of the platform. I had about 40 minutes to wait. I put my earphones in and opened a document I needed to review. The platform was lit with those yellowish overhead lights that most older stations use. They give everything a slightly washed-out look, especially at night. There were families with luggage, a few vendors packing up their stalls, a group of college-age boys sitting at the far end talking loudly. Normal, completely ordinary. About 20 minutes into the wait, I noticed the man sitting at the far end of my bench. He had been there when I sat down. I was fairly sure of that, but I hadn't paid attention to him. He was sitting very still with his hands resting on his knees. He was wearing a white kurta and dark trousers, and he was staring at the tracks. Not at the far end of the platform, not at the board, directly at the tracks in front of him. I noticed him because of the stillness. Everyone else on the platform had some small movement, shifting weight, checking phones, talking, adjusting bags. This man hadn't moved at all. Not once. Not his hands, not his head, not his posture. He was completely motionless. I took out one earphone and looked at him properly for the first time. He appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, gray at his temples. He wasn't disheveled or visibly distressed. He just looked extremely absent, like his body was present and whatever animates a person was somewhere else entirely. I don't know why it bothered me. People zone out at railway stations all the time. It's 11 at night and people are tired. I put my earphone back in and went back to my document, but I kept glancing at him. After another 10 minutes, he still hadn't moved. The train announcement for the platform had come and gone. People had shuffled around adjusting positions. He hadn't responded to any of it. I was debating with myself whether to say something when he turned his head. He looked directly at me. I would have preferred that he hadn't. There was something wrong with the look, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. It was more subtle than that. His eyes were focused on me clearly. He was looking at me, but his expression held absolutely nothing. No acknowledgement, no social reflex. When someone makes eye contact with you and realizes you've noticed them, there's usually some small response. A look away, a brief nod, a slight adjustment. Nothing like that happened. He was looking at me exactly the same way he had been looking at the tracks. I looked away first. I opened my phone and pretended to read something. My heart was doing something it doesn't usually do in railway stations. A few minutes later, I looked up again. He had turned back to the tracks. I started paying attention to who was around me. The family 2 benches down, the vendors, the college boys, normal people. I felt slightly ridiculous being unsettled by a quiet man sitting on a bench. The train announcement for my train came about 10 minutes later. People began standing and gathering their bags. I stood up and reached for my laptop bag. When I looked at the bench again, the man was already standing. He was facing the tracks. He was standing very close to the yellow line. Too close. His shoes were at the very edge of it. The announcement was still playing, reminding passengers to stay behind the line. I stood there for a moment watching him. Part of me was calculating whether to say something. There's always a version of these situations where you intervene and the person looks at you completely normally and says they're fine and you feel foolish, but there's the other version. Before I could make up my mind, he turned around. He walked away from the platform edge toward the exit at the far end. I watched him until he reached the staircase and disappeared down it. My train arrived. I found my seat. I put my bag in the overhead rack and sat down and didn't open my laptop for the first 20 minutes of the journey. The rational version is that he was a tired traveler, waiting for a different train. The yellow line proximity was coincidental. The expressionless look was just a private person having a hard night. I have no way of knowing which version is true. What I do know is that when the train pulled out of that station, I looked back at the platform through the window. He was standing there again. On the platform, at the edge. He hadn't gone down the stairs after all, or he had come back up. He was standing exactly as I'd seen him when I first noticed him. Perfectly still, facing the tracks. I watched him until the platform disappeared from view. I haven't been able to fully explain that to myself. Not the stillness, not the expression, not the return to the platform. I've tried. I've told myself a dozen different rational stories about who he was and what he was doing there. None of them feel complete. That was 2 years ago. I still think about that platform sometimes when I'm traveling at night. I think about stillness in places that are supposed to be full of movement. and I think about the particular weight of not knowing what you actually witnessed. This one took me a long time to talk about because it happened close to home. Not in some remote location, not during a trip. This happened in the city I live in the apartment building I'd been living in for 3 years. I want to be clear up front that I'm not someone who frightens easily. I've lived alone for most of my adult life. I've traveled alone, worked late nights alone, dealt with the various uncomfortable situations that come with living by yourself in a large Indian city. None of that had ever genuinely scared me. This did. The building I live in has 6 floors. I was on the 4th. The building across the small lane from ours is similar in height and layout. The distance between the 2 buildings is maybe 12 to 15 feet. Close enough that during daytime you can see into the opposite flats reasonably clearly if the curtains are open. Most people keep their curtains drawn. That's just an unspoken arrangement that develops when buildings are that close together. The flat directly across from mine had been empty for about 8 months. I knew this because of the building I could see from my kitchen window, that the flat's windows were always dark and the curtains never moved. Occasionally I would see the building's watchman open the door for someone who appeared to be checking on the property. But no one had moved in. Until that January. I noticed the lights on one evening while washing dishes. Simple enough. Somebody had finally taken the flat. I didn't give it much thought. I'd never particularly registered the emptiness, and I didn't particularly register the occupation. It was just background information. The first thing that struck me as odd happened about a week after I realized someone had moved in. It was a Tuesday evening. I was in my kitchen making dinner, maybe 7:30 in the evening. Normal city sounds outside. I happened to look up toward the opposite building. The flat across from mine was lit, but the curtains were drawn. However, there was a gap in the curtains. Not a large gap. Maybe 2 or 3 inches at the center where they didn't quite meet. Through that gap, partially visible and partially shadowed, was a person standing and looking out. Looking toward my building. Looking toward my window. I assumed they were just standing near the window doing something. Maybe looking at their phone. Maybe just standing. I looked away and continued cooking. But when I looked up again a few minutes later, the person was still in the same position. The gap in the curtain, the face not quite visible, the stillness. I closed my kitchen curtain and finished cooking. I told myself it was nothing. The same thing happened the following evening. I was more alert to it this time, around the same hour, 7 to 7:30. I looked toward the flat and the gap in the curtain was there and the figure was there, standing in the same place, at the same angle. On the 3rd evening, I didn't look. I just kept my curtains closed throughout dinner. This pattern continued for about 2 weeks. I never saw the person move. I never saw the curtain opened any wider or the figure shift position. Every time I looked, the gap was the same size and the figure was in the same place. It started to feel less like someone who happened to be near their window and more like someone who had specifically positioned themselves there. I know how that sounds. People stand near windows. People look out without thinking about it. But there's a difference between someone glancing toward the street and someone standing at a specific angle, in a fixed position, at a consistent time every evening. The thing that escalated had happened on a Friday night. I had been out with a friend and came home around 10:30. I went to the kitchen to get water and out of habit I looked toward the building across the lane. The curtain gap was there, but the figure was no longer standing at it. Instead, the curtain had been pulled back slightly more than usual. And rather than a partial face, I could now see a hand pressed flat against the inside of the glass. Just a hand, fingers spread, palm flat, pressed against the window, looking toward my building. I stood there for a moment, just holding my water glass. Then I closed my curtain. I didn't sleep well that night. The following day, I mentioned it to my neighbor, the woman who lived 2 doors down from me on the same floor. She had lived in the building for much longer than I had, and knew most of the residents and the general rhythms of the building. I described the flat and what I'd been seeing. I tried to keep it factual and not dramatic. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she told me that the flat had been empty for so long because of a dispute between family members over the property after the original owner passed away. She didn't know who had moved in recently. She said she would look into it. She came back to me 2 days later. She said that as far as she had been able to determine from the building's watchman and the building society records, nobody had moved into that flat. It was still listed as unoccupied. No new tenant, no new owner, no formal arrangement of any kind. I didn't know what to do with that. I looked up property dispute procedures and told myself there were 100 normal explanations. Someone using the flat informally, a family member staying there without going through the official process, an arrangement that simply hadn't been documented, but that didn't explain the hand against the glass. That image stayed with me for a long time. I ended up requesting a flat change within the building about a month later and moving to the other side of the building. I gave a reason related to ventilation and sunlight, which was partially true and not difficult to justify. I never directly looked at that flat again after the night with the hand. I don't know who was standing there every evening. I don't know why they were standing there. I don't know whether the flat was actually occupied or not, because building records can be wrong, and the watchman doesn't always know everything that happens in a large building. What I know is that for 2 weeks, every evening between 7 and 7:30, something in that flat across the lane was looking toward my window. And on one Friday night, whatever it was pressed its hand flat against the glass. I still keep my kitchen curtains closed, every evening, without thinking about it. It became a habit before I even realized it had. Some habits form for very good reasons,